This webinar is actually made possible by a grant from the Department of Justice, Bureau of Justice Assistance. As a quick overview, we'll go into welcome and presenter introductions. And for some of you, I don't know to the extent that you know about the Uvisa or you work currently with the Uvisa, but we thought it would be best to provide a quick overview of what the Uvisa is and just touch on common areas of common questions or common misconceptions about the Uvisa and just clarify that briefly. And then the meat of this webinar is actually focusing on making connections between law enforcement and advocates, and then going into ways of maintaining, managing, and developing those relationships. And as I mentioned, we will have a question and answer period, but at any time that you have a question, please be sure to just send me a message via the chat box or just use the raise your hand function during the duration of this webinar. And if you're just joining us, I'll remind you just to use the mute function to mute your lines. Just press *6 on your phone. So the National Immigrant Victims Access to Justice Partnership is actually a partnership between two organizations, the Legal Momentum and Vera Institute of Justice. And Legal Momentum has offices in D.C. and in New York, and essentially their charge is they're a national policy organization that specializes in crime victim assistance and providing legal protections for immigrant crime victims. And I work for the Vera Institute of Justice, which is the other partner, and we're essentially a nationally recognized independent center for justice and policy. And we work with a number of different law enforcement agencies and have a number of different grants that work toward making justice systems work more effectively. So as part of this partnership and this grant, we're able to develop a number of different materials very much geared towards training and guiding law enforcement on how to use the Uvisa as an effective crime-fighting tool. So part of the tools and materials that we've developed is a toolkit, a Uvisa toolkit that has model protocols and policies that law enforcement can use, as well as a flow chart to better clarify the role of law enforcement in terms of the overall Uvisa application process. And just to clarify that the law enforcement role is to do the certification, which is one part of a very complex immigration process. Also, as part of the partnership, we're able to provide local training. So annually, we provide 6 trainings across the country, and we're able to provide technical assistance to different law enforcement agencies. And technical assistance just points to any law enforcement agencies that has attended one of the trainings and wants either follow-up assistance in terms of drafting policy or follow-up assistance in terms of just clarifying what the Uvisa is and what the Uvisa certification does. So today we're actually joined, we have 2 presenters. We have Detective Stacey Ivy of the Alexandria Police Department and Natalie Nanasi of the Tahirih Justice Center. The Tahirih Justice Center is a nonprofit, and as you see, it works to protect immigrant women and girls from gender-based violence. Their offices are in Falls Church, Houston, Baltimore, and Natalie's role is a senior immigrant staff attorney and pro bono coordinator with the center, and she's worked on a number of different immigration relief petitions, including the Uvisa application. Our second presenter is Detective Stacey Ivy of Alexandria Police Department. And so Alexandria Police Department, it has a diverse department of about 308 sworn officers and 138 civilian employees. And they provide a number of different services to their residents and visitors. Detective Ivy's role, she's currently assigned to the Financial Crimes Unit, and previously she was assigned to the Domestic Violence Unit. So the DV unit in Alexandria is mainly the unit responsible for investigating not only all domestic violence-related crimes, but also a number of different stalking crimes that occur in the city of Alexandria. And both Natalie and Stacy have experienced training law enforcement on the use of the Uvisa, not only through the partnership that we have with Legal Momentum, but also on their own. And they've also co-authored an article entitled The Uvisa, an Effective Resource for Law Enforcement. And that article appears not only in the October 2009 FBI Law Enforcement Bulletin, but also in the Uvisa Toolkit. And with that, I will turn the presentation to Natalie. Would you like to begin?
Great. Thank you so much, Pradine, and thank you, everybody, for joining us. As Pradine mentioned, we're just going to start with doing a really, really brief overview of the Uvisa. I'm going to try to do this pretty quickly because I know that that's not the reason that we're here today, but I thought it would be really helpful for everybody to at least be roughly on the same page about the Uvisa, what it is, and what the process is for receiving the visa. So very briefly, and Pradine, are you going to be forwarding the slides? Hello?
Hello?
Okay, just wanted to make sure. Okay, it looks like we're all on the right slide.
Perfect.
Just as you can see on this slide, the Uvisa is a temporary visa for non-citizens who are victims of crime that have suffered substantial mental or physical abuse as a result of that crime and are willing to cooperate with law enforcement in detection, investigation, or prosecution of the crime. So breaking that definition down just a little bit, essentially, the person who is applying for the Uvisa has to be a victim of what's called a qualifying crime or criminal activity, and we'll go through on the next slide of what those qualifying crimes are. They have to be helpful to law enforcement. And that definition of law enforcement is pretty broad, so that includes police officers, prosecutors, as well as judges, child protective services, or any agency that has what's called criminal investigative jurisdiction over that particular crime. And helpful is also defined very, very broadly. And so the victim can be helpful in detecting the crime, which just means reporting the crime to law enforcement, in investigation, prosecution, conviction, sentencing, really at all phases of that criminal justice process. In addition, the person has to suffer, and the official legal term is substantial physical or mental abuse as a result of having been a victim of the crime. So it's just important to note that the Uvisa is available for people that really have been victimized and are really suffering as a result of that victimization. They obviously have to possess information about that crime, and probably most importantly, the crime has to have occurred here in the United States. So those are just really briefly the requirements of the visa. As I mentioned before, there is a list of crimes for which the Uvisa is available. It's not just any crime. And you see the list here in front of you on the slide, and I won't go through every single one of the crimes. They're listed here, my organization, because we work only with women and girls who are fleeing gender-based violence. They're listed here in the order that we typically see them, and they are with the domestic violence crimes and the sex crimes really being the primary types of criminal activity that we see with our Uvisa eligible clients. It is important to remember with all of these crimes that they tend to be violent crimes and serious crimes, and also crimes against people. So you're not seeing on here, breaking and entering. You're not seeing trespassing. It's really crimes that are violating the personal integrity of people. This list is not an exclusive list. You'll see underlined there that any similar activity, because the Uvisa is a federal law, it's intended to really cover the wide range of different ways that different local jurisdictions may call a crime. So for example, where I am here in Virginia, and where Detective Ivy is here as well, there isn't a law on the books that is specifically against quote-unquote domestic violence. What we have is assault and battery on a family member. But that really covers that domestic violence in there because it's substantially similar enough. So just really important to know that this is the list of crimes, but don't feel too constrained by them, because if you have something that's somewhat similar to the crimes on this list, then the person may still be eligible for a U visa. And just the final thing to note as the overview is sort of what is the application process like. So the most important part of the U visa application is what's called the law enforcement certification. What that is, it's a form, it's a 3-page form that is signed by any of those law enforcement agencies that I mentioned before, so the police, prosecutors, judges, any of those agencies. And the form essentially certifies that the victim, the person who's applying for the U visa, has been helpful to them in either the investigation, detection, prosecution of that crime. That form is an absolutely essential piece of the U visa application, because without it, the U visa is going to be denied. However, it is not the only piece of the U visa application, and so there's a number of other different types of documentation in terms of proving both that the crime happened and that the person was helpful, as well as proving that the victim suffered that substantial physical or mental abuse as a result of that crime. There's the person who's applying for the U visa has to submit a statement or a declaration. So there are a lot of other sort of moving pieces of that U visa application, but again, that law enforcement certification piece is really critical, and that's why the focus of the webinar today is really to talk about how to really build relationships between advocates and law enforcement so that that really critical law enforcement certification can be submitted on behalf of victims who may be U visa eligible. So once the application is submitted, it gets sent to an immigration office called the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, that's the USCIS, and they adjudicate the application and will usually roughly within about 6 to 8 months give the person, the applicant, a decision on the case, and hopefully it is that they have granted the visa. The visa is valid for 4 years, and it does provide work authorization for the individual as well. The principal applicant can also petition for certain family members, and after 3 years of being in that U visa status, they're going to be eligible to file a separate application, and it's important to note that that's a separate application process, but they will be able to file for a green card at that point, they and as well as any other family members for whom they have petitioned. So that's just a brief overview of the U visa, and I will turn it over. Oh, actually, no, I'm not going to turn it over yet. I'm going to move on to the next piece and talk about one more thing, and then I'm going to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Detective Ivy. So. We're moving on. Sorry, I'm hoping that everybody is seeing these slides into the part of the presentation where we're talking about making connections. Because sometimes really the most important thing, and as an advocate myself, I think sometimes trying that first initial contact with law enforcement, it can seem really, really intimidating if you don't know any police officers. I know for maybe some of the law enforcement folks on the call today might be hard to imagine, but you can be very intimidating. There's something about the uniform, and it can be really nerve-wracking, I think, sometimes to even try to reach out and make those connections. And, before we talk about maintaining connections and developing connections, the first thing to do is how do you even get in the same room as people? So the very first thing that's important is to think about in your existing arsenal and in your existing life, what are the ways in which you are already kind of positioning yourself to make contact with some of those members of law enforcement. So some things to think about is whether, especially if you're working in victim services, you have any victims that you're working with that are also working very, very closely with, let's say, a particular detective. I think that can be a really great way to reach out if you have a victim that you're working with in common, to sort of talk about that person and think about, is there a way that we can work together to help that person? In addition, there are often, I know here in our community in Northern Virginia, we have a lot of different community task forces, meetings, trainings. There are a lot of both local and national conferences that are open to both advocates and law enforcement to try to meet people. I think sometimes it's going to those conferences and going to those meetings, it's hard to push yourself outside of your comfort zone to go up, extend your hand, introduce yourself to somebody, but that's really the best way to sort of meet people, is to go put yourself out there, be in the community at some of these other events. In addition, using your other connections that you have. So I always think about, I have a lot of, there was a jurisdiction that we were working with here in our area where I had some difficulty and I didn't know anybody within that particular county's police department. But what I did know, and who I did know, was an organization that provided counseling services to victims of sexual assault. And they were funded by the county, and they worked very, very closely with law enforcement. And so when we were thinking about instituting the Uvisa protocol in that jurisdiction, we went together. I went along with that other county social services provider to the chief of police, and they already had a really, really great relationship with the police department. And so sort of utilizing some of those other connections can be really, really, really useful. The next bullet here talks about existing opportunities. So it's an appropriate story to tell because Detective Ivy and I met when I went on a ride-along through a program that the Alexandria Police Department has. And we have since developed a really wonderful working relationship and friendship that has lasted now for a number of years, and it was really through that existing mechanism that we were able to even meet. And I know I've done ride-alongs in D.C., and I know that most police departments do have those programs, so that can be a really, really great way to reach out to make connections within the law enforcement community. Finally, the other thing to think about is whether it makes sense to, when you're doing that initial reach out, to think about if you are going to to try to make that contact from the top up or the top down or bottom up, pardon me. And it really, a lot of it can depend on whatever personal relationships you have developed. So for example, using Detective Ivy and I as an example again, when we were looking to implement a Uvisa policy within the City of Alexandria Police Department, she and I worked together on it first, and it was something that Stacy was able to draft and then move up the chain of command within her department to get the final authorizations. And that worked really well given our relationship because we were able to put it together, and she knew that within her department, unless somebody wrote it, the chief wasn't going to sign it. That being said, I've worked in other agencies where the chief wants to do everything him or herself. And so having that initial reach out be to really the highest point in that chain of command was going to be the most effective way to get that policy in place. And so it's just something that's worth thinking about. I don't think that there's a right or wrong answer. A lot of it depends on the particular jurisdiction. But to think about which way you want to go about approaching a particular agency or a particular jurisdiction. So I think that's all I have on that. I don't know, Stacey, if you have anything to add on that slide, but otherwise I will turn it over to you on common goals.
No, we could go right for the common goals. Thank you. Let's see. So as everyone kind of already quasi-introduced me, I'm Stacey Ivy. I'm a detective with the Alexandria Police Department here in Virginia. I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the common goals that law enforcement and advocates share in reference to victims and all the positives that can come by us working together. So our common goals can easily be our initial connection, and those goals include holding perpetrators accountable increasing public safety, providing redress to victims, and building trust in the community. And all of those goals allow for us, to just foster better relationships with the citizens that reside in the areas where we work. And we want those relationships because that's the whole concept of community-oriented policing, is having that kind of rapport with our citizens, whether, illegal or not, so we can know what's going on in the community, so we can help victims, so we can help, prevent and detect crime. So, it's a goal that everyone should share because it is the betterment of everyone. And so the common goals and benefits of a Uvisa certification for the victim, benefits are very clear-cut. They can report a crime without fear of deportation. It can enhance victim safety. It can enhance community safety, increases confidence in law enforcement. And that one is particularly important because if they're willing to come forward on a domestic assault and battery where they do receive some kind of benefit, they may be more inclined to then reach out if they witness something, another serious crime, or for that matter, any crime. And so that kind of rapport will just help, the citizens grow and work with the police department, which, of course, is one of the law enforcement benefits. Speaking from the law enforcement side, Natalie and I felt it was very important to actually address the benefits of law enforcement because everyone had focused so much on victim benefits that it was very important to see that law enforcement truly do get a very, helpful benefit from the use of the Uvisa. And so, like I said, it does increase our capacity to detect, investigate, and prosecute criminal activity because now we have the rapport with the community and we have a trust from the community. It helps us identify, victim witnesses and offenders, and identifying offenders is critical because that will then lead to crime reduction, but it also leads to offender accountability, prosecution, possible compensation for the victim. But if anyone's ever worked with a victim, them hearing that someone is guilty for their actions, sometimes that's all they ever need to hear. And, as law enforcement, we want people held accountable for their actions because if we can help break the cycle of violence, we can maybe move on to the next crime. Furthermore, that benefit, as Natalie brought up earlier, getting that work visa, that work authorization, it potentially allows for us to then decrease identity theft cases because now there may not be as many people out there, not saying that the victims necessarily committed this crime, but there's far less likelihood to want to take a job with a fake ID. So that's less, effect that we'll have on, identity theft, that can actually help the Social Security Administration because now we're not, messing up Social Security benefits when wages are being earned unlawfully under someone else's Social Security. So the benefits not only help the immediate law enforcement, but can easily help other agencies. And so as we continue with a little bit about enhancing community-oriented policing, it bridges the gap and builds the trust between the police and minority communities, which is critical, because we have enough barriers to that relationship as is. Sometimes it's language, sometimes it's culture. So every little bit of effort on the law enforcement side helps, gain the trust and support that we need from the community. And it also allows us to then partner with the community to solve crimes and keep communities safe because that's our goal. We don't want people hurt. We want to help people. And, by law enforcement actually using the Uvisa, it's expressing a commitment to the victim that, law enforcement's interest is safety for everyone. It doesn't matter what your status is here in the United States. The fact is that we're here to protect and serve, and I don't know of any department that says we will only protect and serve, U.S. citizens. So, but we need to show that. Some people have that fear, so it's important that we really demonstrate our commitment. And so, let me go to the next one here.
Okay, so this is the slide that we like to call It's officially entitled Respect Fosters Dialogue, which is just a much nicer way of saying you should always just treat others the way you yourself would like to be treated. And it seems, in some ways silly to almost talk about this and say this, but I do think it's just so critically important when you're talking about building relationships to not forget these just really fundamental ideas. So the first bullet point here is about good intentions is really just thinking positively, not to sound too much like a self-help book here, but when you go into it, and again, I know I mentioned sometimes advocates and law enforcement don't always have common goals, but as Stacy just finished discussing, I think when it comes to the Uvisa, we really do have a lot in common. And so I think having that really good frame of mind of saying, this is something that we want to work on together. This is an area in which we absolutely agree, and we both have an interest in protecting victims, of keeping our community safe. And so just saying, this is an area where collaboration would be wonderful, and just going into it assuming that everything is going to work out well. And I think sometimes having that really good attitude can go a very long way. Obviously, whenever you're working with somebody, making demands, telling somebody how they have to do things, when they have to do things is never a good way to get something that you want. And so I think it's really important to try to be respectful, to try to really understand some of the other people's time constraints and some of the issues that they may be facing on their other end. So, either when attempting to put a certification process in place, or even when requesting an individual certification, it's always better, it sounds so silly to say, but it's better just to ask somebody, to ask the prosecutor, to ask the detective, would you please sign this certification for me, and not demand and not shove it in their face and say, this is something that you have to do because I promised, and that is that's probably not going to get you what it is that you ultimately want at the end. And again, that same kind of on that same note, that final bullet point, just to remember to be polite. Don't be pushy. Don't belittle. Just really, again, I work sometimes with other lawyers. I know lawyers don't always have the best reputation and can sometimes forget to treat people with respect. But I do think it's just absolutely critical, because I think if you come into something with polite, respectful intentions, then you're just much more likely to get what it is that you would like at the end of the day. So that's my kindergarten moment there for you all, and then I'll turn it back over to Stacy.
Thank you.
I can just hear her. You can hear other people talking. I can't hear anybody.
Hi, hello. Are we having, is anyone having difficulty hearing right now?
No.
Hello? Are we okay with sound? Just a reminder, if you could please mute your phones. I'm not sure if we were hearing side conversations. Okay. Okay, perfect. Go ahead.
Okay, so we're back with me. That's Stacy now. So I'll try and speak as loud, but please, if anyone can hear me, feel free to just throw it on the chat, and I'll try and yell and be, I guess, my usual brute self. So what I'm going to address a little bit is, discussing about having open communication to dispel myths.
Hi, Stacy. Sorry, yes. 1 moment. If you could just talk a little bit louder, I'm receiving chats that people are having difficulty hearing you still.
Let's see if I can raise this. Okay.
So feel free to yell and scream. Thank you.
I can do that, definitely.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay. What Natalie and I did several years ago was we wrote an article that really addressed the common fears and concerns that law enforcement might have when dealing with a Uvisa. And so we felt it was very important for, any advocate or anyone that was representing a victim to just not be afraid to tackle the difficult issues and questions that very commonly rise with law enforcement. And what some of those concerns include, but certainly are not limited to, law enforcement's fear that there's going to be a swarm of illegal residents filing false police reports, and that we'll be inundated with these kinds of crimes now, or they'll report other fraud. And so it's very important to address that and remind your local law enforcement, and there should be, as in the state of Virginia, there's many other reasons why people might file false police reports. They might have bankruptcy issues. They might be trying to get back at, an ex-boyfriend or girlfriend. So the U-Visa, while it is possible, it's probably not probable, as Natalie and I used to say. It's kind of far-fetched for someone to go through such severe, potentially physical and emotional duress and potentially have their loved one be deported in order for them to receive this benefit. It's a lot of effort. This is not, a quick process. It's time-consuming. It is intensive. And that helpfulness will be required by law enforcement. And so also, in just, tackling other difficult issues, it's important, to understand what the role of law enforcement is in the U-Visa. Some law enforcement are afraid that by them signing, this 3-page I-918 Supplement B, they're now constituting sponsorship, which it's very important to make it clear to the law enforcement agency that is not the case. We are merely affirming that the victim has been, is, or is likely to be helpful with the case at hand. And also it's important to remind the law enforcement agency that should that helpfulness change, our affirmation that they were helpful can be rescinded by contacting USCIS. And so honesty is the best policy when discussing these issues and concerns, and hopefully it does ensure a fruitful partnership. But there's many concerns that can arise. There's also personal issues that some law enforcement might have where, some law enforcement might feel that if they were legal and they were not here illegally, then they would not have been a victim of a crime. And while the answer is, well, you know what, you're right, it doesn't change the fact that the very federal government whose, rules and regulations are being violated by an illegal's presence, they're the same government that created this exception. And while it's not mandated that every law enforcement agency enacts the U-Visa, they're allowing for it to happen because they recognize the greater good of having the relationship with the law enforcement and just better community-oriented policing and all the benefits that both victim and law enforcement have as a result of working with each other. So a little bit about maintaining, managing, and developing relationships. So one of the things that Natalie and I did was we essentially put it in writing. And we'll get to that part in a minute. But what, many agencies do have, there's written policies, guidelines, or standard operating procedures, or SOPs as we like to call them, that clarify the partnership or an agency's internal procedure. And every agency is different. Some agencies won't review a U-Visa request till after the case has been prosecuted. Others will take it long in advance. It's up to the individual agency. So for an advocate, it's important, to think what the policies on U-Visa certifications should include, as is who is the best person to contact. As Natalie said before, do you start from the top down or the bottom up when you make your request? Already established what is the best way to contact, the the person at the law enforcement agency. Or do they prefer phone, email, letter, fax, smoke signals? I mean, anything's possible, so you just want to see what their preference is because you really want to work with them. Again, they're not mandated to have to work with you. They're going to want to work with you because they're going to see the benefit. What should the advocate send to law enforcement? Well, while that can vary for every law enforcement agency, I know Natalie is always gracious enough to send us, you know, a sample of the Uvisa, the case number, all the involved parties. So if it is a case that we haven't worked in a significant amount of time, we can easily pull it up. We can find the photos. So anything that you have in reference to the case, you can send a copy. Don't send us originals. Send us a copy of it, and that'll help possibly, you know, jog someone's memory in case we have additional questions about the case. And so whatever kind of system you agree to with your local law enforcement agency, you know, both sides, you know, it says must adhere to it. You know, the hope is that everyone will adhere to it. I mean, it's important that we all work together, we stay on the same page. I know what you expect of me, and you know what you expect of, I expect of you. There we go. Make sure I said that right. So with Natalie and I, we do have what's called a sample cooperative agreement that the Tahirih Justice Center designed and created. And the cooperative agreement not only is beneficial to both, you know, the Tahirih Justice Center, but it's also benefits me when I speak with someone on the Alexandria Police Department who may not be aware of the Uvisa program. I can actually go back and say, oh, well, the police department does have a cooperative agreement on file, so now it provides a little bit more validity when I talk about it because, hey, my chief of police, the head, has signed off on this, you know, on this relationship, and we do support this. So I don't know, Natalie, do you want to chime in and talk a little bit about the cooperative agreement and the sample?
Yeah, I mean, you know, as you can see, it's pretty simple. This isn't the document that lays out the Uvisa certification process. That's actually something different where that talks about, you know, what the process is for requesting, who to send those requests to, that kind of thing. Really, this is almost a higher level type of agreement that just says that when the City of Alexandria Police Department comes across somebody who they think they may be eligible, who they think may be eligible for a Uvisa, then they'll send them to us. And that what we will do at that point is attempt to assist them in applying for a Uvisa. And so I think it really does formalize that relationship, the relationship that we have with that police department. And we have comparable agreements with a lot of other law enforcement agencies, a lot of other different cities and counties police departments here in the area, as well as a lot of other social services agencies as well. We provide primarily legal services, but there are other agencies that may provide housing services or you know, shelter services or mental health services, things like that. And so it really does help kind of formalize that relationship and make sure that everybody involved, and sometimes the agencies can be very, very large, can then know, you know, a detective that is maybe new to the department or an officer who's just going out for the first time knows that the Tahirih Justice Center is a reputable agency, knows that when they send us victims that we'll be here to assist. And I think that that really provides a level of comfort, really at an organizational or an institutional level, that the agency is legitimate, that they do good work, and that it's a safe place to send victims to. Does that cover it, Stacy?
I think that was perfect.
Okay. So moving on to, I know there are a lot of advocates on the webinar today, and I just wanted to talk about some of the ways that you, if you are coming to law enforcement, requesting a Uvisa certification form, some of the things and the best practices that we have here at the Tahrir Justice Center that ensure that those certifications will be signed in a timely fashion and in a proper fashion. You know, I always like to think, and I do this when I'm making my certification request, but I do it really when I'm even sending the full Uvisa applications to Citizenship and Immigration Services. I like to imagine the desk of the person to whom I'm sending my request. And if it looks anything like my desk looks right now as I'm sitting here looking at it, it has piles of paper everywhere. It's overflowing. There's things on the floor. There's just a lot going on. And naturally, I think people are going to gravitate to the tasks that are easy, to the tasks that they can complete simply. And so really, I see my job is making law enforcement's job or the certifier's job as easy as humanly possible, to provide them with as much information as I can from the outset for them to understand what the Uvisa is, what it is I'm asking them to do, and why it is that the person that I'm reaching out to them about is eligible for this visa. So this also really varies based on the jurisdiction. So when I'm sending a request, for example, to the City of Alexandria Police Department, I can skip the whole, let me introduce you to the Uvisa, here's what it is, because I know that they already know that, right? But what I am always going to do, no matter what, is to make sure that I send in documentation of the fact that the crime happened and that my client was helpful. So all the case documents that I may have in my possession. And that's really, really nice because much like many of your agencies, I'm sure, law enforcement has systems, right? Once you input maybe it's a last name, maybe it's a case number, maybe it's a birth date, what that's going to do is that one critical little piece of information is going to yield just a treasure trove of information about a particular case, about a particular perpetrator, victim, incident, whatever it may be that they're looking for. So sending as many documents as you can not only sort of shores up your claim that the client was in fact helpful, so they should feel completely comfortable signing that certification form, but also gives them any of that specific information that they may need to be able to do whatever additional research that they need. So those case documents include what's listed in that second bullet, often have case numbers, dates, all kinds of those critical details that are really, really important. And I'll oftentimes put just a short cover letter on those case documents with that request for the certification that just lists out why I think my client is eligible. And it's not a long, complicated thing. It just says I'm representing, client X. She was a victim of domestic violence on X date. This is the name of the perpetrator. Here's what happened with the case. This is the case number. And the perpetrator was arrested. There was a court date on X date in this judge. Here's that case number. And this was the outcome, sentenced to 2 weeks in jail and a year of probation, the end. And here are the case documents to prove that what I'm saying actually happened. I find that makes their life just very, very, very easy because they don't have to do any more work. They don't have to add any more things to their to-do list. They can just look at that packet that you've sent and sign the certification form. And then the other really important piece is what's listed there in that final bullet is I usually will send a mostly, sometimes I don't have all of the details, but a almost completely filled out certification form so that if they want to go ahead and sign that certification form, again, just making their lives as easy as possible. Of course, kind of going back to that respect slide that we were talking about, I also don't like to be presumptuous. I don't want to assume that the way that I have understood the incident, the way that I have written some of those descriptions, are the way that that particular certifier, that particular agency is going to want to fill out the form. So I also always include a blank form for their convenience. Again, I know it sounds silly, but they don't have to take the time to go on the internet, find the law enforcement certification form, which can sometimes be a little tricky to find, print it out, that everything that they need is really just right there in front of them. And I think that just really increases your chances of actually getting that certification form back in a timely fashion.
I guess I'll do the next slide. So as you know, the highlighted part reads, remember patience and flexibility are really the key. With law enforcement agencies, we're always changing. So policies change, personnel change. So it's very important to keep the lines of communication open with your contact or contacts with the agency. Promotions happen. Unfortunately, people can get fired, so you just never know what is going on in a department. If an emergency arises, with law enforcement, a Uvisa certification may be less of a priority. For me, I work 3 weeks a day work a month and 1 week at evenings a month. So when people try and reach me during the day, I don't come in till nighttime on one particular week. So there might be a whole week without contact potentially from me. So while I would easily recognize that a Uvisa certification may be very important to the advocate or the person assisting the victim, we have to remember still that law enforcement, when emergency calls go out, everyone might have to respond to it, and anything we were working on will get put on a back burner. And so it's just very, very important to remember that different jurisdictions, different law enforcement agencies, different police departments have different policies. Every department is different. So it's very important to know what the policies are of each department so you know how to work with them and you don't have any unnecessary expectations. And so that'll bring us to slide 26, which I think Natalie and I will talk a little bit about together. So as Natalie and I have done before in the past, we've trained together, we've published together, but that training, those publications, again, just bring more validity, to the common goals that we share. And the training, the trainings are provided to law enforcement agencies. They're also provided to multidisciplinary teams when trainings get held, especially when they're free. We have a lot of people come because it's free and people can afford it. So there might be joint presentations, and again, they just add legitimacy and can increase outreach success. The more people that we have that work together, it's the more people that we know, and better relationships again get fostered. So in publications and or other media is show your community the benefits by co-authoring articles, as we did back in 2009. You can easily write an editorial or participate in joint media efforts. You can always get in touch with your local radio station. If there's a certain language that's prevalent in your community, see what kind of outreach, outreach there is in general in the community. Are there religious outreaches? Are there cultural outreaches? And so get the word out there that you want to work with them, so we can all benefit from the effects of the Uvisa. Natalie, you want to go on the work on the policy and or advocacy?
Yeah, absolutely. And I don't know, I'm not sure how relevant this is going to be to everybody, but I thought I'd mention it because it's a way that we actually work very, very closely with law enforcement. So my organization, in addition to representing, doing direct client representation, we have a public policy department, and they do statewide as well as national advocacy on a lot of issues that affect our clients on issues of domestic violence, sexual assault, and the like. And so oftentimes if we are advocating for a bill. So for example, there was a time about a year or two ago where we were working with a coalition of advocates here in Virginia to pass a law in the Virginia State Assembly that would provide protection to immigrant victims to immigrants who were victims of crime. So it would have prevented law enforcement from asking about the immigration status of those victims. And when we did that, we actually reached out to the chief of police of the Fairfax County Police Department, and I believe somebody from Alexandria as well, and they came and they testified at those congressional hearings, and it was a really good opportunity to, again, kind of think about those common goals and talk about why protecting this community was advantageous to really everybody involved. The other thing that I would definitely recommend is, I know that many advocacy agencies, many of you probably rely on donations and public support, and so you're often having events. You know, when we moved into our new office, we had an open house event to which we invited a lot of our different partners. We have an annual fundraising benefit every year, and whenever we have those events, we absolutely make sure to invite our law enforcement partners to that. I think it's a wonderful opportunity for us to see each other outside of the normal work context, to really move that relationship into a different stratosphere, you know, that to instead of always being colleagues, to sort of develop friendships in that way. But the other really wonderful thing, and I remember this happened when Detective Ivy and her boss, who is now the assistant chief at the Alexandria Police Department, came to our annual benefit, and we invite clients to that benefit as well. And so they were able to to speak to a client that that the Alexandria Police Department had worked with when she was in absolute crisis, and it was just at a really, really terrible point in her life. They had subsequently referred that client to Tahereh. We worked with her. We got her a Uvisa, and she was at that point in just a much more stable place. She was working. She was happy. She was dressed nicely. And I remember Stacy's boss saying to me, you know, it's so nice because oftentimes as law enforcement, we really only see somebody at their absolute worst in these crisis moments. And so to be able to see that the Uvisa really does help them move on. It helps them attain that self-sufficiency that we're talking about with that work authorization. It helps them escape from an abusive situation. It helps them move on with their lives and really begin to heal from some of the violence that they faced. I think that can be incredibly, incredibly gratifying. On the other side, I think for myself as an advocate, really going to police departments and going to roll calls and going on ride-alongs, I think really, really helped me understand kind of what some of the pressures law enforcement is facing on the other end. And as Stacey was mentioning before, you know, I know for me that Uvisa certification sometimes seems like the most critical thing in the world, and it's absolutely so essential, and I have to get it yesterday, and it's so, so important. But I think when you go and you're sitting in a police car and you're responding to some really life-threatening emergencies where you're there and you see, oh my gosh, it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon and there's one person on staff because there are budget cuts or people are working the late shift or the early shift, and to really be able to understand what the processes are at some of these law enforcement agencies can just be incredibly valuable, because you really do start to see the other side of some of those issues and really be more appropriate in some of your requests and develop those relationships in that way. And so I think, Stacey, unless you have something to add, that may be all that we have, and might turn it over to Pretty.
I could only
questions.
just, reiterate what you said. It's so great, especially when you call me and let me know the progress, or the result of a victim that I might have personally worked with that now has received the U-Visa, and the changes in their lives that they're experiencing, which is just all for the better. And my hope is never to see someone in the same circumstances that I first met them, and so to hear that they now have this opportunity, it's both personally and professionally rewarding. So, it just really is. And so I guess with everything, we'll move on to the question and answer period, and I think Pradine will assist with that.
Sure. Thank you very much, everyone, for participating, and thank you to our co-presenters for providing insight into their personal experience and how they've been able to partner together. If anyone has any questions, or if anyone has sent me any questions in the last 10 minutes or so, I will open it up again for any additional questions. I wasn't receiving questions about 10 minutes ago. My connection dropped. So if you have any questions regarding the Uvisa or specifically any questions regarding how Stacy and Natalie have been able to work together or any complications in their partnership, feel free to ask. So one question that we have, people ask about witnesses and whether witnesses qualify for Uvisa as well. So Natalie, could you speak about the indirect victims aspect of the Uvisa and how witnesses may be able to qualify?
Absolutely. So the general rule is that the Uvisa is for victims and not for witnesses. So it really is specifically intended for victims, direct victims of crime. There are a couple of very narrow exceptions. The first is bystanders to crimes may be eligible for visas in very, very, very limited circumstances. And so the bystander to a crime that I think is probably the closest to a witness would have to suffer what's called unusually direct injury as a result of having been a bystander to that crime to qualify for the Uvisa. And so I can give you the example that is actually given in the Uvisa regulations, and this was the example that was put forth by the Immigration Service to describe sort of that level of unusually direct injury, which is that if you have two people who are standing next to each other on a street and a gunman comes and shoots person A, person B, who is then the bystander to that crime, is pregnant in this scenario. And she is so distraught by having been a bystander or witness to the crime that she loses the baby. That would be kind of the level of unusually direct injury somebody would have to suffer in order to qualify as a bystander under the Uvisa. So as you can see, it's a very, very, very high standard. I know that there have been several people who have successfully gotten bystander Uvisas for parents who have walked in and witnessed their children being sexually abused. But again, it's a very, very, very high bar. Now, the other slightly different aspect of this, as Pradeen mentioned, is there is a provision that indirect victims of crimes under certain circumstances can be Uvisa eligible as well. And thinking back to the purpose of the Uvisa, which is really to facilitate law enforcement's ability to investigate and prosecute crimes, in the event that the direct victim is either incompetent, incapacitated, or may be deceased as a result of the criminal activity. So the example is in the case of a murder or an attempted murder where, let's say, the victim is either deceased or the victim is in a coma, and the victim then, him or herself, is going to be unable to cooperate with law enforcement to provide that helpfulness. There are certain family members, usually either children or parents or spouses, who can qualify as indirect victims in those circumstances. But again, those are very, very narrow exceptions. So for the most part, the Uvisa really is just available to direct victims of crime.
Great, thank you. Another question that we have is about the average time that it takes for a Uvisa to be issued, and also can you talk a little bit about the percentage rate about Uvisa applications being processed, the percentage of the applications that actually get processed and granted, and some of the trends in the ones that are not granted?
Oh boy. You know, to be honest, the adjudication time is, as we mentioned before, somewhere in the neighborhood of 6 to 8 months. The other really important thing to remember is that there actually is a cap that's imposed by Congress. So there are only 10,000 Uvisas that are available in each fiscal year. For the past 2 years, they have actually reached that cap, but it usually has happened very, very, very close to the start of the next fiscal year. And so what happens is that if the cap has already been reached, let's say in early September, those applications are basically held and then adjudicated and granted in the following fiscal year, which is in October 1. Now, in terms of success, I'm unfortunately, I almost don't even want to say this out loud because we here at my agency have been very successful in getting our U visas granted. I think I've only had maybe 1 or 2 denied, and those were on technicalities, and I was able to win on appeal. And I actually don't know. I unfortunately don't know. Maybe, Preeti, we can get people this information because I'm sure there's statistics available about generally nationwide what the likelihood is. I mean, what I do know is that if you have the certification, if you have a crime victim who really did in fact suffer harm, if you can demonstrate that they've been helpful, then you should be able to get the U visa approved. Now, again, I would definitely recommend, I should put my plug in, that people seek legal advice if at all possible. I know that it's not always possible to have a lawyer help somebody with an application, but I know there are a lot of agencies like my own that provide those services free of charge to really make sure a lawyer does look over the application, because I do think that substantially increases the likelihood of success. Because a lot of times, there are details and technicalities and different places that you have to mail your application. Immigration can be really, really complicated. And so if you have somebody with expertise, it's just always, I think that definitely increases your chances. So hopefully I answered the question. I know it's not quite on point, but at least something.
Perfect. Are there any other additional questions? It's about 4, and I know we were supposed to end at about 4. But if you do have any additional questions about the U visa or about our toolkits, please feel free to contact us, or you can actually reach me. I will be sending the PowerPoint, emailing the PowerPoint to anyone who registered for this webinar. And in addition to the PowerPoint, I'll send links to things that I've mentioned, such as the toolkit, which actually provides an in-depth look into some of the sample policies for the U visa certification, and also just gives a really in-depth look at the U visa requirements that we kind of just touched on just because of the nature of the webinar. I would like to thank everyone for joining us. And as you can see, there's a list of contact information there. And there's a link actually to our partner's website on this slide as well. So I would like to thank everyone again for joining us, and have a great afternoon. And I'll be in contact with the presentation and additional helpful links.